Jane Evans was a Welsh housewife and office worker in her 30s, and in the 1970s was hypnotised and regressed back to past lives by Arnell Bloxham, who was a respected practitioner and president of the British Society of Hypnotherapists. Jane had initially sought help from Dr Bloxham about a physical ailment she was suffering from, where Dr Bloxham then hypnotised her. But in an unusual twist, whilst under hypnosis, Jane Evans started to reveal past lives. Her earliest description of a past life was set in the 3rd century during the rebellion of Carausius, the Roman admiral who seized power in Britain and declared himself emperor. Jane Evans claimed to have been a woman called Livonia, who was a wife of a tutor by the name of Titus. They lived in the town of Eboracum in the year 286 AD. Eboracum was a fort in the Roman province of Britannia and was the largest town in northern Britain and provincial capital. It later developed into the present-day city of York in North Yorkshire, England. Titus's pupil was the son of Constantius, the Roman governor of Britain, and Titus and Lavonia lived in a villa and were involved in much of the politics of the day. As Lavonia, Mrs. Evans described how Constantius needed to return to Rome, and a rebellion was engineered while he was away, where the British revolted against Roman rule. The governor's wife Helena and son Constantine, including Titus and Lavonia, were forced to flee from Eboracum and escaped to Verulamium, which is now called St Albans in Hertfordshire in southern England. In Verulamium, they lived in fear until the rebels were eventually overthrown by an army led by Constantius. Unfortunately, Helena's husband's triumphant return brought only sadness for her. Due to Roman power struggles, her husband was forced to divorce her, and a new marriage was arranged with Theodora, the daughter of Emperor Maximinus. Helena chose to stay in Verulamium with Lavonia and Titus. In Verulamium, both Helena and Titus are influenced by Christian woodcarver by the name of Albinus, where Titus became fervently religious and volunteered for the priesthood. Before Titus could be ordained as a priest, Roman troops attacked Christian houses and burned them down, and Titus lost his life, and a short time later, Lavonia also loses her life. Both Helena and her son Constantine survived. She later became Saint Helena, and her son Constantine would become Constantine the Great, the emperor who established Christianity as a religion throughout Roman Empire. Her next regression was in the same location in northeast England, where instead of Eboracum, the town is now called York. However, this time she is a Jewish woman named Rebecca, and the year is 1189 AD. Her husband's name was Joseph, who was a rich moneylender, and they lived in the wealthier part of town. She spoke with fear and anger about the attitude of the Christians, who, she said, would borrow money to finance their wars and build their cathedrals, then persecuted the Jews unmercifully in return. As with her previous love as Lavonia, Rebecca was also murdered, this time at the hands of Christians during the York Massacre, where she, her husband, and 2 children attempted to hide in the cellar of a church outside the city gates. In her current life, Jane had had no knowledge or association with Jewish people or its culture, but under aggression, she had an amazing knowledge of 12th century Jewish history, where she was able to describe the life of a Jewish woman living in York. She describes Jewish life at the period of time where they were forced to wear badges. She described a terrible massacre of the Jewish population by the local townspeople. Rebecca and her family had prepared to leave the city, but had left it too late, and were able to run only as far as the castle of York, but were unable to find safe shelter. They were then forced to take shelter in the crypt of a local church, where they took the priest and his clerk captive. From the safety of the church roof, they could see flames and hear people screaming, "Burn the Jews!" The priest and his clerk managed to escape and alerted soldiers who came into the church. It was at this point in her story that Jane appeared to be filled with terror as soldiers took away her daughter. Then she whispered, "Dark, dark." This was when they were apparently murdered. In order to verify what Jane Evans had described, an expert by the name of Professor Barry Dobson was called in. Professor Dobson lectured at York University and specialised on Jewish history, and was asked to verify the information that Jane Evans had given whilst under regression. He was extremely impressed at how accurate she was in describing life as a Jewish woman in 12th century York, and that many of her details would only have been known by professional historians. Professor Dobson determined that the church she'd hidden with her family would have been St Mary's Castlegate, but at the time he believed it would not have had a crypt, which she claimed they had hidden. He also claimed that Jews were not forced to wear badges until a later date. But on further research, they found that making Jews wear badges did take place in 12th century England, and several months later, researchers were doing renovations in St Mary's Castlegate and found a sealed chamber below the floor, which appeared to have been a crypt, which would have been a rare phenomenon for churches in the area. Jane Evans' regression brought forth details that proved to be historically accurate and had yielded historical information that was not currently available at the time. Jane Evans then went on to describe other lives, which she claims she was an Egyptian teenager called Alison, who was a servant employed by a man called Jacques Coeur, who was a wealthy 15th century French merchant and financier, and confidant and advisor of King Charles VII of France, and would later become his treasurer. Alison described the life of a high-ranking Frenchman in the royal court, and about the king's mistress called Agnes Sorel, and the clash between the Dauphin Louise and King Charles VII. She talked about Coeur's possessions and his luxury house of Bourges in central France. She could accurately describe her master's clothing, which was a tunic edged with minever, red hose and shoes of red Cordovan leather with a jewelled belt around his waist. It appears that Alison was in love with him, that he was in love with her. Jane was able to accurately describe Jacques Coeur's fall from grace, where he was once close to the king, but after the death of Agnes Sorel, a rumour spread that Coeur had poisoned her. Records showed that Coeur was arrested and tried on a number of charges and imprisoned. However, Alison only knew about his arrest. Alison's life came to an end after taking poison that Coeur had given her as the king's soldiers had arrived to arrest him. Her next life was in much less detail, where she lived in the 16th century as a lady-in-waiting to Catherine of Aragon. Then much later, she described her life as a 17-year-old sewing girl who lived in London by the name of Anne Tasker around the year 1702. After that life, she was a nun called Sister Grace who resided in a convent in Des Moines, Iowa in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, who passed sometime in the 1920s. The regression of Jane Evans was shown on television, where the audience were amazed by her detailed stories and were convinced that she was not acting, especially when she appeared to show genuine fear and emotion, and the way she was able to grasp the difficult names and places she'd once been a part of. When Jane Evans was awake, she was adamant that she knew nothing about any of the lives she'd described. Her televised regression became known as the Bloxham tapes, where a housewife from Wales was able to accurately convey her genuine knowledge and experience about the past.